Fantastic. Okay, so I was going to move on now. I've seen David, Hannah, and Chris Ward join the call. You're both very welcome. I know David can keep us entertained for quite a long time.
About
Um,
2 hours.
he's got he's got some great stories and got a lot of experience. So welcome, Chris, and welcome, David. You should be able to share the screen. I think you've got something to share with us, David.
Yes, we have. Thanks, Chris, and good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I have to say that this is most bloody inconvenient, and the most sober I've been at 7:45 in any evening since the start of lockdown. I notice Lisa Ryder is getting ahead of me on this one. I'm having to stick to coffee for the next 30 minutes, but believe me, the Irish iced tea is going to come out as soon as I'm off this call. I hope you're all right. I hope you're all thriving. The subject of my talk, the most boring thing on the planet, stamp duty. But let's see if we can turn this into a bit of a thrill ride for you. I'm going to share my screen. Here's hoping this works.
I'm sure it worked fine. Are you happy to take questions as we go along, David, or do you want to?
Well, I would prefer to run through if you don't mind, because there's a lot to cover, and some of the questions that get raised in the earlier slides are going to be kind of answered in the later ones, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah,
We'll do a Q&A at the end if that's okay.
Yeah, perfect, David. Thank you.
Okay, here we go. Screen 2, he said. Hit share. Can you all see that?
It says Cornerstone, top strategies to save SDLT on your properties. Yeah, fine.
Well, that seems to be the right thing to be then. So a little bit about Cornerstone. We're chartered tax advisors. We were formed coming up for 15 years ago. Good God. We specialise in property tax matters, but specifically we major on stamp duty, land tax. We give you a comprehensive service, certification of SDLT payable, relief claims, advice on structuring, entity selection to minimise your tax exposures. We do post-transaction SDLT health checks, also known as forensic reviews, and do refunds off the back of those. Fully insured, professional indemnity insurance is 1.5 million any single claim. And it's perhaps worth starting with a quick, I'll call it retrospect on SDLT, because a lot of the problems I'm going to talk about with SDLT, and indeed the opportunities, arise from the historical context of this. As you're probably all aware, introduced 17 and a half years ago to replace the old stamp duty. And this is where the problem started. Stamp duty was a duty on documents. It was literally what was called an ad valorem duty. Stamp duty land tax unhelpfully brought in the word stamp duty. And so the lawyers thought that they were still doing business at the same store, when in fact stamp duty was a much more complex self-assessment tax with more principles akin to income tax and corporation tax than they realize. It's incredibly complex. It's been changed more frequently than any tax that I can think of, and is, of course, as I say, widely misunderstood. It applies to all acquisitions of residential, non-residential land and property interests in the UK, but it also applies to acquisition of interests in land that are not represented by a conveyance. So, for example, the acquisition of a partnership interest, the taking of a beneficial interest without transfer of title. And this is where the complexity starts to really build up, because sometimes you can move a title with no tax, and sometimes you can leave the title where it is and still end up with a tax charge, depending on what you've done. These days, it is incredibly complicated because what you pay and what rate you pay depends on a vast variety of factors. The type of property you're buying, the type of purchaser you are, the nature of the transaction, connected or not, the number of dwellings you owned or currently own, the nature of the consideration provided. And from the 1st of April this year, you're going to be an extra 2% surcharge if you haven't lived in the UK for 182 days, or your company is controlled or has participators that aren't resident in the UK. Welcome to the mad world. As a result of which, there are now multiple rates for the same property. In fact, A barrister who lectured on the new 2% surcharge commented that there are now 16 different tables of rates for SDLT, depending on which surcharges you do and don't fall into. Be afraid, be very afraid. Why should you? Because solicitors, conveyancers, they don't have the time or the fee budget to fully understand the intricacies of SDLT. They're not tax experts. They probably don't really understand the deep detail of your transaction. They don't understand the 44 exemptions and reliefs that could apply. Typically, if you ask a solicitor, and when I used to be the stamp duty land tax lecturer for Central Law Training before they closed it, it was nothing to do with me, by the way. And typically, if you asked a room full of lawyers how many reliefs for SDLT there were, 80% of the people in the room would tell you that there were fewer than 10. That means 4 out of 5 lawyers are getting less than 25% of the reliefs in their brains when they're looking at a transaction. Worrying. Quick resume. Where are we now? These are the current rates of residential SDLT, the current rates with the surcharge. As I've already said, there's going to be a surcharge payable from April 2021. But if you're outside the residential environment, and sometimes dwellings are not residential, I'll come to that, you can see that the rates are dramatically lower. And so there is some advantage in looking for or finding that non-residential element. So we've seen, I would call it, an increasing public and press focus on SDLT. And what is the problem? This is particular interest to the private rental and the development and the convert to rent and permitted development conversion developers. Up until November last year, the revenue were insisting that where you did a mixed use multiple dwelling calculation, consider a permitted development office block or block of flats with a retail unit or a commercial unit on the ground floor. That is altogether is what's called mixed use. The revenues guidance said that you had to pay the minimum rate of the surcharge of 3% on the residential element. 23rd of November last year, after a 3.5-year battle with them, they climbed down and admitted that in fact the minimum rate should have been 1%. What does that mean? A lot of people will have bought these types of properties and these types of developments since 2016, followed the revenue guidance and overpaid their tax. And there's a lot of focus coming in on that now, asking people to review in case they have or overpaid it, or indeed didn't claim multiple dwellings because they thought, because of the wrong revenue guidance, that the multiple dwellings calculation wasn't beneficial, when in fact it should have been. Next big problem area, big scandal been uncovered, slowly developing and building up pace. The fact that when partnership businesses transfer or sell property to their SIPs or their small self-administered pension schemes, they've been paying SDLT. But there's a rule in stamp duty that says where you transfer from a partnership to something that is connected, the SDLT is almost invariably nil. This problem's been going on for 13 years. There's a developing concern at the highest levels in this country, right up to and included the Houses of Parliament, about how this problem has arisen. It's estimated there could be as much as 10 billion overpaid over the last 13 years. What's all this doing? This statistic: stamp duty refunds, reviews up 285% during lockdown 1. I suspect during lockdown 2 it went even higher and possibly may yet go higher still. The conveyancing industry is starting to worry about this now. They're realizing that they have been getting things wrong. Not the big things I'm talking about here, but the simple things, like you buy your own home, it has an annex. The solicitor fails to claim multiple dwellings relief on that annex. Net effect is you overpay your SDLT somewhere between £10,000 and £87,000. Even on the smallest property, you could be £10,000 over. Worth going back and looking to see whether the house you live in or any of the stock you've bought came with annex, with an annex. I still can't work out. Does anybody out there know? Was the plural of annex, annexes, or anni? I've never been able to work that one out, but a Latin scholar will tell me it's not anni.
We'll see if we get an answer to that one.
Yeah, if there's a Latin scholar on, please let me know.
I can't guarantee that.
Well, yeah. The case of PM Bewley, this bears down on when you're buying a property that is not fit for human habitation. It's not suitable for use as a dwelling. Many of you may buy what we call fixer-uppers, properties that are in need of substantial refurbishment, and you couldn't reasonably live in it yourself or legally put a tenant into it at the point you buy it. If that is the case, that property, maybe a terraced house, is actually not a dwelling for SDLT purposes. So you shouldn't pay the surcharge and the residential rate, you should pay the commercial rate. The Bewley case was the lead case on that point. And generally, we formed the view, and I think it's been borne out by industry statistics, that there could be up to 2 billion a year being overpaid in stamp duty because of these fundamental errors in calculations. When the Times ran a story, good God, nearly 3 years ago, the revenue were asked to comment because the HMRC's online calculator is actually misleading. It doesn't point out any of these things. It doesn't allow you to do multiple dwellings. When the Times questioned HMRC, their spokesman came out and said that their calculator was meant to be a guide and not a final figure, and you are supposed to do the calculation properly. Those of you who use HMRC's online calculator as your guideline for what you are doing will know that nowhere in there does it say, oh, by the way, you have to check this. It actually says, click here to tell you how much to pay. One might fairly argue that that is misleading in my view, but there we go. So what can developers do? Well, if you're considering a development, doesn't matter how large, how small, you can do pre-deal evaluation and advice. Now, this can even happen before you put an offer in. You've looked at a scheme, you think it might be viable. You want to get your costings right going in, particularly if you're tight on affordability for commercial mortgage. What should you do? You should come in, you should take advice as to whether there are reliefs available, what can be done, cost structuring, to make sure that you get your project evaluation correct. You should obviously look at the maximizing your reliefs, permitted development, multiple dwellings relief being the primary one in this sector. Are you structuring your sales tax efficiently? Are you using SPVs as standalones, or are you using them in a group? This can have an effect on your ability to move assets, i.e. land, but also funding around to help cash flow developments. And fine, everything, timing your deals, staging an acquisition, for example, staging when you get on site. Instead of exchanging conditional contracts, exchanging options. Why? Because you can go on site without triggering an early tax payment, which you would do had you exchanged contracts. And finally, if you've already done the deal, if you've already completed, as I've already said, we can go back, we can do a review for you. So let's just talk permitted developments, conversions, and multiple dwellings. Let's use this as a case study. This is a real life case study. Property developer acquired an office block with the benefit of permitted development, right to convert 31 dwellings. 2 million paid and works to convert the apartments had commenced. He paid 89,500, commercial building, commercial rate. It's obvious, it's right, isn't it? In fact, multiple dwellings relief was available because some of the works had commenced before he bought it. And so it should have been 60,000. The net difference of 30,000 we managed to get back from the revenue. But the question is why? Now, I'll take a straw poll before we take questions, but hands up on screen if you've done a multiple dwellings calculation before. Well, one hand I can see. That's probably one more than I expected. Thanks, Andy. But let's just walk you through this. You divide it by the price paid by the number of dwellings in the deal, or putative future dwellings. You then, as I've mentioned, do strip out. So you take your 2 million, you divide by 31, 64.5. You do the SDLT. In this case, it was wholly residential, so the minimum rate was 3%, 1,935 per dwelling. You multiply that back up by the number of dwellings to give yourself the £60,000 bill, which is less than the 5%. So logically, you would claim the relief. But if that conversion had got commercial space in it, for example, we'd left a coffee shop on the ground floor, it would have reduced the SDLT to 20,000 or 1%, which would have been a fantastic win for the client. And that's pretty much how you do MDR. You just need to understand or need to be aware that even on a building that you haven't started working on converting, it may still be available depending on what works of strip out or close off have been done. What's really interesting about this is that for these situations, you have to do your calculation 3 or 4 different ways, and then you're allowed to take the best result. That's actually in the revenue guidance somewhere at about page 9,427. So it's quite obvious not. For other reliefs that primarily impact on the private rental sector, developers and property traders are particularly, house builders or property traders buying from the personal representatives, i.e. probate deals, buying part exchange properties from people who are buying a new home from a house builder, who are stepping in to restore a broken chain, sometimes called chain break relief, or are buying from employees that are relocating, subject to certain conditions. All of these are exempt from SDLT. Now, I know I've spoken to a few small traders who've abandoned deals because they thought they had to back-to-back subsell in order to get an SDLT exemption rather than buy it, spend 10,000 on a refurbishment to pretty it up and then sell it on. It's not true. With these reliefs, if you qualify and if the property qualifies, you can afford to buy it, spend a little bit on refurb. There is a maximum amount, by the way, and then sell it on at your own leisure and still not pay SDLT on the acquisition, which is a significant addition to your bottom line margin on those sort of deals. Tax efficient vehicles, we all operate through SPVs, but many of us don't have them owned or under common control of what's called a holding company. We tend to use what are called associated companies where we own all the shares. The inefficiency of that is if you need to move assets around, maybe you've got a property development company, but you want to move some assets from development to investment company, or you've got a dealer who wants to deal in a property but can't sell it and needs to move it to investment and so on. Those, if you're not in a group, you will pay SDLT again on moving them between vehicles. Whereas if you're in a group, you get a relief. And you move away from these punitive second charges on SDLT. The other thing is you can't then lend money between associated companies without the potential for incurring a punitive tax charge, a payment of what's called advanced corporation tax, or you're forced to take a dividend out of company A, pay the income tax on it to lend it again to company B. If you're in a group, you can move capital around freely inside the group with no tax penalty whatsoever. As I say, all these issues go away. In terms of deal efficiency, how could you get on site without triggering substantial performance? Well, the clue in substantial performance is it's only there if you've already exchanged contracts. So if you're going to exchange a conditional contract subject to planning permission, consider taking a call option subject to planning permission. There is no contract in place. If you want to go on site and start works or do preparatory groundworks, knowing that you're going to get the permission actually, then If you're in option, none of that accelerates the tax payment. Whereas if you've exchanged a contract, getting going on site brings the tax payment forward, not from the date of completion, but to the date you go on site. Here's an interesting thought, though. In the current conditions, people are worried about completing before the end of the SDLT holiday. But if you were to go and take a license to occupy the property that you can't complete on, that would bring forward the payment date for SDLT and bring it into the holiday, giving you that £15,000 benefit. So you could use it to your own advantage. Staging site assembly, again, you can use this to both avoid the substantial performance by buying the site or completing on parts of the site in tranches, even though it's under a single contract. But similarly, if you could buy part of a site, start construction, it's still regarded as a single bargain for multiple dwellings relief, and you could trigger multiple dwellings relief on the entire site. Tends to be for larger developments, but it's still worth considering if you're into that. And the second thing is we've seen some people who've got double charges. Again, people who buy sites without planning permission. So they buy speculatively, they go through the planning process, but they've already got a joint venture deal or a deal with somebody else to sell them part of the site once the planning's obtained and the development uplift is there. And that leads to a double charge because A pays SDLT when he buys it, and then when B buys his share, he pays SDLT again. And that's avoided on a quite simple basis, which is if when A buys it, he buys not only for himself, but as bear trustee for B, then it's deemed to be A and B buying it, so that when B buys from A, he's actually buying from his own share out of his own trust, and there is no tax. And that can be quite useful. Again, if you're into that kind of early stage relationship with onward purchasers who will only buy with planning permission. This is the big question that was raised by Bewley. What is residential? What is suitable for use as a dwelling? And what is not residential? It's logical to think that most dwellings are residential property, but only if they're 100% so. The slightest element of property that is not residential in nature makes that property non-residential. So if you have commercial activity on the site, farming, horticulture, woodland, equestrian, retail, motor engineering, I've seen that on a semi-detached house in Nottingham, anything, existence of business rates or a business rates exemption, indicative that there's been a trade on that site, automatically makes that property not residential. Look for commercial buildings or the commercial use of buildings. Interestingly, the receipt of commercial rents, licenses of the land, or way leave payments are all regarded by the revenue as property business income. And property business income is taxable to income tax and is, again, a primary indicator that the property is not wholly residential, and you can claim the lower mixed ratio rate and not pay either the 3% surcharge or the new 2% non-residential surcharge. You have to look at the traditional habitual use of the land, and any kind of trade, believe it or not, however small, including selling the eggs from your chickens, according to one tribunal judge that I listened to, would get you out of residential into mixed use. So what you need to do is to look to establish the true relationship of the land to the building. It's a little bit more involved than that, but basically look for elements of the property that just would not be normally part of a house of that size, character, or nature. And as I said, SDLT rate falls to 5% to 12 to 15%. Now, I've got a whole raft of examples, and I'm not going to take your entire evening up, despite the fact we're all watching repeats on Sky and have been for the last 6 months. We've got an example here, permitted development. An example there, we had a client who was a property trader doing a probate. His lawyer advised him to pay 176,000. Not a bad result when you can ring somebody up and tell them it's nil. Again, developer wanted to move property between two companies, was advised it was market value. We simply created a group, saving him 130,000. Substantial performance, advised the developer only to go on to 1/3 of the site, because that was all he needed to get onto to demolish the house and clear. And that meant that substantial performance wasn't triggered. So we didn't bring forward the SDLT payment. And the bonus money on that was, of course, by the time we did complete, there was no house on it. So the land wasn't residential. It's kind of neat. This particular developer then went on. He tends to buy large houses on large plots, demolish them and put flats on, mainly in Greater London. He now has a condition precedent that the vendors actually make their property uninhabitable before he'll buy them, because he knows he's going to demolish them. I would not advocate somebody having a vendor do that and then 3 weeks later putting the kitchen, the bathroom, the toilet back in and moving in. I don't think that works, and I'd be very clear that that's probably a little bit too risky.
So you'd, in that case, David, you'd have to do. You think to demolish would be necessary?
I think where there's no demonstrable substantial need for the building. In other words, you're going to do something else with it. You're going to knock it down or partially demolish or substantially renovate it. So you're going to take it from a 5-bedroom house to 12 apartments. You might retain part of the original structure. Then why pay residential going in if you don't have to? Because you're actually better off saying, look, we're going to knock this thing down anyway, so we may as well get the vendor to do some damage to it prior to going in, because at the very most we're exposed to 5%, not potentially 15%. And we're still possibly going to get the MDR as well if the conditions are satisfied.
Yeah, that's good.
Now, in terms of investors and private clients, everything I've said on MDR could apply to investors. Look for your reliefs, single, multiple units. Look into all the applicable reliefs depending on what you intend to do with the property. Granny and her annex is causing the legal profession nightmares at the moment. There are claims firms out there. I saw a report just at the end of lockdown 1 last year that said one law firm had over 1,000 claims for Miss Granny Annex relief referred to it, which it's a substantial problem. Residential or not, I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. Make sure you've got all the circumstances down. Make sure that you've looked at it, looked in detail. We have clients now who, it shocks clients when they say, do you want to see the contract? And we say, no, but you can send us the sale particulars, site photos, survey reports, electricians, we want to see everything that tells us whether or not somebody could live in this house. That's really what matters to us. Look for reservation plot sale agreements, reservation exclusivity agreements or options. I recently heard a judge say, and I agree with him, that where you've put down a reservation deposit of £2,500, which is a reservation agreement under NHBC terms, that in and of itself is a separate taxable transaction, and it should render the actual acquisition of the house subsequently non-residential, because that taxable piece of paper, that reservation agreement, is only taxed at 5%. And when you combine it with the actual acquisition of the house, that gives you a mixed use transaction. We've been doing refunds from the revenue on this basis for the last 2.5 years and got a considerable number of refunds out of them. Interestingly, though, they don't seem to agree in their guidance. And I tend to judge people by what they do, not what they say. If you've in the private rental sector, not necessarily just in the private rental sector, you will have seen this rush, this need to incorporate. In some cases, we've had people disincorporating for different reasons. But if you are incorporating, disincorporating, moving property by gift, contribution, sale to connected parties, pardon me, folks, a lot of lawyers will assume that these are at the cash value or market value. In actual fact, it simply isn't the case. Transfers to or from limited companies, trusts including pension schemes, family members of trading or investment properties, where there are multiple owners, i.e. multiple individuals owning or buying, are generally free of SDLT because of the partnership rules, the connected party rules and partnerships. It's quite amazing because this has been the law since 2007 and we're still finding solicitors and accountants who don't understand these rules. We must have done over the last 13 years, I think probably 500 to 1,000 incorporations and disincorporations, always with the revenues agreement, always, and using these rules. So we know what the revenue practice is and we know they do agree it. And still to this day, we're still getting people telling us, no, that can't be right. One of the perceptions out there is that if the SDLT figure I quote you is less than the figure you first thought of, it must be wrong. But I think you can all agree, just on some of the things I've gone through tonight, that the first answer you get to is the one that probably is wrong because we haven't gone into it deeply enough. As I said, most solicitors ignore the issue. Sorry about this. A few more examples. Annexes and flats, cottages in the ground, £10,000 overpayment. An acquisition made subject to an exclusivity reservation agreement, paying 10,000 for the reservation. Revenue agreed, not wholly residential, refunded him 97,000. Property that was uninhabitable, 1.755 million. We got the client over £100,000 back with the revenues agreement. And the big one, connected parties and companies. Sorry about the detail on this, but you have to understand, we identified here that the vendor transferor was to a company from a property investment partnership. No SDLT was due. We got the client £24,000 back. And those are just some examples, and they're all real world cases, naturally anonymized. So just give you a few closing numbers. Over the last 12 months, we've recovered over £12 million from HMRC. We've advised on another £18 million pre-transaction. By the way, folks, these are the tax figures, not the property values. You need to remember your tax rate can vary from as much as 15, soon to be 17%, to as low as 1% or nil. And within boundaries of SDLT, all of those outcomes are possible, depending on all the factors that I've outlined. How do we charge? Well, we charge 25% of the tax saving. In other words, if we can obtain a reduction or a refund, we will charge you 25% of it. Fully covered on our PI, 1.5 million any single claim. If the revenue seek to, shall we say, have a ruck with us, we're obliged to defend it for you out of that fee. And if ultimately the revenue win, then our insurance pays out. How it works? Well, there's a website there because somebody got the animation the wrong way around. Sorry about that. Mm-hmm. You can go to the website, you can email us, or you can call us. Thanks for listening, everybody. And that, I'm afraid, is the end of Death by PowerPoint. Now back to Death by Questioning.
That's remarkably well with little or no alcohol, David. So you did really well. Well done. Well done.
If the camera suddenly goes off, I carry on talking. It means I've nipped outside for a cigarette, Chris. All right, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. But you'll get away with that one.
Oh yeah.
So really, really interesting. I think this is a sort of majorly misunderstood, a sort of criminally misunderstood area, really, because it has so much potential to get it wrong, and it obviously is being got wrong quite a lot, and it's very pertinent, obviously, to
well, I lay the problem not at the doorstep of the solicitors, but at the doorstep of a I'll call it an environment that encourages you to click on and do an estimate. So you've got a number in your head once, and then you go to your lawyer, and he does the same thing, and then you get the same number twice. By the time you've heard it a third time, you've kind of fixed it in your own mind that has to be right. You don't question it.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. That's no, I think that's absolutely right. I'll open it up to the floor. I mean, I've got a stream of questions of my own, but I'll open it up. I think I know Sue's got a question. Sue, would you like to ask your question?
Okay, I typed it because my internet's clearly very rocky tonight. But so will you interrupt me if nobody can hear me? And would Chris maybe read it if they can't? Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly. So yes, I will step in if it's a problem.
I've closed everything else I could on my computer during the evening because it was so bad earlier. David, I was very interested in your other earnings off the land thing with your way leaves and selling eggs, etc. What about things like a home office where you're trading a business from the garden? Does that make it mixed use?
Yeah, it's an interesting one that the revenue do not accept that use of home as office, and I would agree with them, necessarily makes a property mixed use. But compare and contrast, if you've got a small woodworking business and you're running that out the garage and selling the joinery, then it does.
Yeah, well, that was more what I was meaning, actually, rather than doing my job from home. I was talking about something like the joinery. There's a guy locally to me who makes bird tables that he sells off the front garden and things like that.
Yeah.
Has he got a mixed use building?
Yeah, I believe he has. It's because he's carrying on a trade which would not normally be part of what I would call normal domestic activities, nor is it incidental to domestic activity.
And does that go to people who do hairdressing and dog grooming, etc., from home as well? Those kind of things.
Yeah, the revenue have been a bit funny on this. They've said that anybody who uses their home and converts the front room to a dental surgery, as far as they're concerned, the property is still residential because, quotes, the dental surgery could be used for residential purposes. They've got an interesting idea of what people do on a Saturday night. But I mean, I think you would argue that if the room that is used can be easily changed back or used for a residential purpose, then no, you haven't got it.
Yeah.
Whereas
your lathes and baths for chrome dipping and
yeah,
spray setup or whatever is very different. Yes.
Yeah, if you've actually got an arms and ammunition factory in the basement, A, you've got mixed use, and B, you've got a world of hurt because SO19 will be round to see you in about 3 minutes. Of course, there is the old American story of a 15-year-old kid who actually built a fast breeder nuclear reactor in his dad's garden shed, and that's actually a true story. I mean, apart from the fact nobody would want to buy the house, arguably that house was definitely mixed use at that point. But yeah. It's all about fact and degree, which is why it's very hard to give anybody a clear set of rules.
Yes, well, they like it like that, don't they? I'm an accountant. I mean, they like the grey zone because they can argue either way.
Well, I've just seen a letter which is not in my area, and it's not in the public domain, but it's something to do with, shall we call it, stamp duty, the stamp duty and shares, where the revenue have clearly changed their guidance, but they're arguing that the change of guidance doesn't amount to a policy change. I mean, really? You're having a giraffe, aren't you?
Doesn't it? It happens a lot in other areas.
Too often. Sorry, this is a couple of accountants arguing, folks. But it's it's the perennial frustration of us as practitioners is that, I mean, I had a case last year where we went into court. It was a mixed use case. It lined up with HMRC's guidance. And the opening remarks from counsel for HMRC was, Your Honour, we want you to give our guidance less weight than a textbook. In other words, we want you to ignore it.
I mean, none of my accountant friends ask for guidance anymore because it changes every time.
Yeah, there's no point. But you try and tell the revenue that, they go, oh, no, you have to listen to guidance.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, you're welcome.
Yeah, that's good question, Sue. Thank you. Anybody else?
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
David, how far back does this go? I mean, I'm just thinking, for instance, my sister bought an old farm, which has an annex in the garden, which actually they're now converting into their dwelling house, and they're splitting the title rights of their other house in half.
Right.
There's also a building, a small building on their plot, which I think in the past was used as a farm shop, although they've never used it as a farm shop. So I'm just curious as to knowing, I mean, my sister is an accountant, so she may well have the answers and it all sorted out anyway. But in terms of, you know, if they bought it, say, 14, 15 years ago and paid whatever, you know, is it from a particular point in time, or is it only going forward?
It depends on whether the error, this is going to get involved, but generally speaking, you want to get to an error inside 12 months.
Right.
Where you've been misled by guidance, or there were things going on that you couldn't reasonably have known at the time, your limit is 4 years.
Okay.
But if the revenue misapplied public policy, this is another accountant thing, then there is no time limit. So there was a case, 2012, I can't remember, 2012 or later, but anyway, it was called Pollen Estates, and it was to do with claiming charities relief, and the revenue were misapplying public policy on charities relief. They were saying if a charity bought jointly with somebody, the charity couldn't have charities relief, and that was self-evidently wrong. When the Court of Appeal decision was handed down, the revenue were forced to invite repayments, not for the last year or the last 4 years, but in fact going all the way back to 2003, 9 years worth. So what we always say to clients is, look, until we know exactly what's gone wrong here, don't assume it's 12 months. It could be 4 years, or it might be longer, but we need to let us have a look. We don't mind having a look. There's no, you know, we do that no charge. We can generally spot something inside the first sort of 15, 20 minutes. Because we've got this dedicated team that do nothing but SDLT, God rest their souls. Boring buggers, aren't we? But, you know, they can look at something and they can ask you 3 questions. I go, yeah, I think it's that. Let's go in that direction. Because they're so finely honed on that one area.
And then in terms of, obviously now, where they've had an annex that was let out on their property, and they're now splitting what was their house in 2, and they'll have to split the title. Where does that all fit with stamp duty?
Well, I mean, they're not changing the ownership, are they? They're just merely
Well, they will be
selling.
They'll be selling off the part that, you know, one part of the house. So the house that they used to live in, they'll be splitting in 2, and part of it will go with the annex that they are effectively converting the whole lot into one dwelling, and the other half will go actually to the developer, the builder.
Right. Well, to use the phrase, that's the builder's problem. But depending on what the builder's buying over and above the half a house, if he's buying half the farmland, the outbuildings, then he's probably buying mixed use land rather than residential land.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay. And
so
again,
he would then potentially claim for stamp duty tax relief.
You would hope.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I'll give you an example, and this is genuine example. We recently got asked to review a case where a foreign client had bought an entire block of 6 or 8 apartments in central London, very central London, for 11.5 million. Now, there's a little rule: if you buy more than 6 dwellings in a single bargain, you're entitled to the commercial rate. But notice they were dwellings, so we could have claimed multiple dwellings. Or you could have paid residential plus surcharge on the whole price and not bothered with the other 2 things. Which one do you think the solicitor did? The worst possible result. We just got that client £1.13 million back in a single check from the revenue. It wasn't exactly complex. As soon as we opened the contract, we went, aye, here we go. This has to be wrong. And it was. We couldn't quite believe that, because even the most jaundiced conveyancers know about the rule, what's called the rule of 6. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you see things that just make you wince and think, were they actually, you know, not was the lawyer asleep? One of the things I did when I was lecturing was I used to do a straw poll of people in the room, and not in terms of how many reliefs do you know, but I used to say, now you get 15, 20 people sent on a solicitor's training course by Central Law Training. And you say, right, hands up if you're a solicitor. And out of 20 people, only 4 hands would go up. Or hands up if you're a conveyancer, licensed conveyancer. 3 hands would go up. Hands up if you're a legal executive or member of the administrative staff, like a legal secretary, and the rest of the hands would go up. And this was what I thought was one of the big problems, was that we weren't getting the qualified lawyers or the qualified conveyancers. They were sending their support staff because they still thought that doing SDLT was an administrative function, not a detailed tax function that required specialist training. And I think that's been the core of the problem. And then we've now got over reliance on computer systems, and as we all know, if the computer tells you, it must be correct. Not. And of course, all those computer systems have copied the HMRC algorithm, which is about as much use as a chocolate teapot, and they've admitted it.
Yeah.
Where does that leave us? In a mess.
Well, it leaves you with a good business.
Fascinating.
Well, it leaves me with, yeah, you're right, quite right, Chris. It leaves me with a good business. But, you know, part of me, the part of me that isn't the businessman in this, that is a citizen of this country, that is sitting there going, but surely after 17 years, we must have been able to sort this out.
Yeah, obviously not.
No, I mean, you know, for a country that can shut itself down, fund its entire industry, mobilize a massive army of volunteers to deal with a national crisis, and do so brilliantly, in my view, develop a vaccine and start to put us all back, and do all that in a matter of literally weeks, including building hospitals out of exhibition centres. Why is it then, if we can get that behaviour out of government and out of our nation, why do we tolerate this kind of behaviour in normal times from our institutions? I don't know why.
No.
But sorry, I'm not running for Parliament, by the way, but I just thought I'd just get my soapbox out at that point.
Vote Hannah. That was a good question, Melinda. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Melinda.
Moving on, any other questions for David?
High five, Andy. No.
Yeah, I've got one.
Oh, hi, Andy.
Probably the question you've been asked 1,000 times now, but moving a single property or a portfolio from personal ownership to an SPV, is there any grey areas on that? Is it pretty black and white? It's the same across the board?
Well, it actually differs vastly, Andy. If the portfolio is in sole ownership, charge to market value. If the portfolio is in joint ownership, no charge at all, because you're a partnership transferring to a connected entity. And that is completely counterintuitive, I accept, but it's actually right.
When you say partnership, you mean an LLP, or do you mean
two people together engaged in business? And right, there were gamut from what's called a partnership at will, Section 1 of the Partnership Act 1890, through limited partnership, through limited liability partnership. They're all treated the same for the purposes of SDLT. They're all partnerships.
So if you can move a property owned by a partnership into a limited company that those people are directors of?
Yes. And
not incur SDLT?
Correct.
So every conversation I've ever had with any property expert in the world has said that's impossible, and they've all tried. So I'm not questioning, I'm like really happy, I'm like, but yeah, just
well, I recently wrote an article for Taxation Magazine, which, if you're not an accountant, you probably don't read. And in fact, if you are an accountant, most of them don't read it, but they all subscribe for it. And it's called The Problem with Partnerships and Stamp Duty. And I'd cheerfully email you a copy of it, because it's a peer-reviewed article co-authored with a guy called Andrew Marr from Forbes Dawson in Manchester. And it lays out why this is the case. And as I said, we've been doing this since 2007 with the revenues agreement, written agreement. So I know I'm right.
Do you have to go through a consultation with the revenue per each individual application? Is it a time frame or?
No, we don't do it anymore, because I think it was about May last year, owing to pressure of work at the revenue side, they said they're no longer going to answer our letters, because I think we're sending them too many. So we said, well, that's fine, but we're still going to send you the letters, recorded delivery, to make sure that we've got a record that we told you. But we're talking about what's called established practice as well as law, and it has been established practice since 2007. It would be a very brave and foolhardy inspector that would attempt to stand up and say, hold on a minute, I think there should be a charge here, because I'd be straight back at him and going, give me your legal basis for it. And when you're having an argument with an inspector of taxes, most of them aren't trained stamp specialists. Believe me, they're not. So what you tend to do is say, look, you state your conclusions, state your reasons, then you go straight back and go, right, what's called a statutory review. It's different to a thing called an independent officer review. If you ask for an independent officer review of an inspector's decision, he gives it to his mate on the desk next to him. I mean, that's really independent, isn't it? Not. But if you ask for a statutory review, he's got to take his file and send it to what's called the Solicitors and Litigation Office, and they review the legal basis. And I've had 2 or 3 where I've done that, and Solicitors and Litigation have written to me and said, so terribly sorry, Mr. Hannah, you're right, he's wrong. Here's your refund check. And this is the other side. This is the subtle side. And this is why you probably, I would argue, you need to employ a specialist. You've got to not only know how to get started, but you've also got to know how to play HMRC if they kick off. And we're fairly good at it.
Really interested, David. That's fabulous. Yeah, as you said, and as Chris said, I didn't think I'd be as excited about this one, but yeah. But yeah, very, very interesting.
Would you mind your details on again? That last slide, because it's gone. It went too quickly.
Yeah, throw that up quicker. It was.
Hang on a sec. I've just lost my mouse. Oh, there he is. There's my mouse.
David, I'll follow up with my email so everybody can come to me.
Okay, that's no problem, Chris. Let me just share the last slide just briefly while we're talking.
Just while you're doing that, David, if I mean, you mentioned about the article you wrote, that would be really good to share. So if you send it in, I can share it with everybody as well.
I'll do that. Yeah, we're out of the embargo period. Otherwise, LexisNexis Butterworth get really upset if people start PDFing around their paid for. But I think we're okay on that one now.
Okay.
Can you see? Can you all see that on screen?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yes, apologies for the speed at which it scrolled through, but it's when you're this late at night, you've had this much caffeine. It's sometimes a problem.
You're doing well. You're doing well. So I've got a question of my own, David.
Yeah.
And it's about evidence, really. So, just for example, you mentioned about if you demolish the house, or if the house is uninhabitable when you purchase it, that no stamp duty was due. So it just got me thinking about, well, so what evidence would you need to provide to say that the property was actually uninhabitable? Like, would you need to provide a surveyor's report or something like that? I'm sure they're just not going to take our word for it that the property was uninhabitable.
The best evidence, believe it or not, yeah, I mean, clearly a surveyor's report, an electrician's report says I've had to turn off the supply to the property because the wiring's unsafe. I've condemned the boiler, it's unsafe. Gas engineers' reports are good. Photographic evidence is brilliant. If you can show a photo with the floorboards missing, the ceiling down, the sink's been ripped out, you're kind of almost certainly home. I would say the more evidence, the better, basically. But yeah, we had one case where we sent something like 64 photos into the revenue, and not surprisingly, they just came back with, yeah, fine, okay, whatever. We had another case where they claimed a property wasn't mixed use, so we arranged a site visit. One of the more hilarious meetings I've had with the revenue, because we made sure that the client had put sheep all over the fields in front of his house.
Yeah.
Inspector drives up, climbs out the car, looks down the hill and goes, are those your sheep? He says, no, they're a neighbour's. I rent in the fields. He went, well, that's it, mixed use then. Climbed back in his car and drove off.
Oh, wow, that's easy for all.
Yeah, but we'd made him drive 2.5 hours because I really don't like him that much. We just thought, if you're going to be a sod, we're going to be a sod to you. But it's really interesting. I mean, I grew up in the era when it was the Inland Revenue, and inspectors were direct assessment. They told you what they thought, and you had to argue back. But the inspectors were very, very experienced and qualified people, and you actually respected their views. And I've never got away from the idea that you can no longer ring an inspector of taxes up and say, Fred, Dave, I've got this situation. What are you used to? We used to, as accountants, we used to use them as sounding boards.
Right.
I can almost hear Sue nodding in the background.
Mhm.
But these days, all those really good inspectors, they're all working in private practice. I know some of them.
Mm.
One of them's a mate. And they all left the revenue
Mm.
because they couldn't stand the bureaucracy, which is interesting.
Yeah,
When we switched to self-assessment in the early 90s, the technical role of inspector was almost effectively abolished. They de-skilled the revenue. Well, look where we are now.
Mm.
Another political point, but no, you will never get. You've got to be. I've always said that you know when you're dealing with HMRC, you have to assume you're going into a fight because they are not your friend, and they are interested in maximising the tax, not getting it right.
Mm. Right. Okay, that's important, isn't it?
Mm.
But in terms of sort of the evidence, it's not just it's just whatever and as much as you can put together. Really, it sounds like, and there isn't that they would insist upon a particular survey or anything like that.
No. I mean, we've got one guy that we use. He's a land use specialist, and he actually goes he's actually an agricultural land specialist. But particularly if we've got land that we think isn't part of the garden or grounds, we'll send him in. And I think one of his reports included several sealed evidence bags, which included sheep droppings. We loved sending that one to the revenue. We did insist they return the sheep droppings once they'd examined them, but
Of course,
yeah.
of course, yeah. No, that's very good. I'll just see if anybody else has got any questions, because I've still got a couple of my own actually, but I will invite questions if anyone's got one. Just unmute yourselves.
Hi, David. Thank you so much. That's really useful information. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
You mentioned, just following up, because my question was the same one that Chris had about evidence. So anything, did you say 4 years? So for residential buy-to-let, did you say there's a time limit of 4 years? Sorry, I logged off earlier. So
No. As a general rule, you've only got 12 months to amend your assessment, but under certain circumstances, your assessment, by the way, is your return, because it's a self-assessment.
Okay.
Under certain circumstances, you can go back up to 4 years.
Right.
So what we say to people is, if you think you've got a problem within the last 4 years, there's two things to establish. One, has it been got wrong? And two, can we correct this with the revenue?
Right. Okay.
So there's a two-step analysis for us to do, but you know, we don't mind you coming and asking us. Well, we really don't mind. I would rather you asked us and we said, "Look, sorry, no, can't do anything," than you said, "Oh, I'm pretty sure David can't do anything, so I won't bother asking."
Okay. All right. Okay, David, it's good to know. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Yes.
Thanks for the question, Topi.
Okay. Very quickly. Is it right? Am I right in saying that the HMRC are incentivized for winning tax, get bonuses if they manage to win a tax situation? I know that. I believe that, because we had an audit at my printing company, and they came in. My first thing my accountant said, "Don't make friends with them. Don't make them a cup of tea. Don't do this. Just chuck them in the corner and let them get on with it." And because they might think that everything you say to them is kind of like a bribe or a nicey, you know, trying to win them over. But my cousin is a lecturer on European tax, and he says there are occasions where they will be incentivized for winning tax situations. I just wondered if that was true.
I will go with what your cousin said. Officially, there is no such thing as an incentivized revenue officer.
Yeah, fair enough.
Unofficially,
Yeah.
we know that each office literally has a league table on a whiteboard. And every time an inspector thinks he's got a good one and he can get some in, he goes and writes down how much thinks he can get in, and then their performance is assessed on those totals. And there was a case we had several years ago, and this perhaps illustrates it, that we put in a multiple dwellings relief on behalf of a major developer who had bought the part of a military base with 184 houses on it. So naturally, we claimed multiple dwellings relief. Well, you would, wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
But the tax difference was, I think, approaching 2.4 million. Quick as a flash, we got a bloody letter from the inspector, and it was the bullshitest checklist you've ever seen. Please provide me with your underwear. Please provide me with this. Please provide me that. And copy of the planning permission, details of any connection between the vendor and the purchaser. Things, just basically trying to make trouble to see whether the client would roll over on it. So we waited until the 28th day of the 30-day inquiry window. You'll appreciate the humor in this in a minute. And we answered question 1, and we said there are no planning permissions because the Secretary of State for War in 1935 was an exempt authority and was not required to have planning permission to construct a military base. We don't have a plan of the site. However, we enclose a satellite photo of the base. And if you count the little terracotta dots, there are 92 of them. Each of these represents a semi-detached house. So multiply by 2, 184. Didn't answer any of the other questions until they got details of any relevant connection between the vendor and purchaser. And we said, apart from a short period of national service by the chairman of the PLC, there is no relevant connection between our client and the Ministry of Defence. Yours sincerely. You'd have thought a reasonable inspector would have gone, yeah, fine, whatever. It took them 8.5 months to answer the letter, and through gritted teeth, she said, under the circumstances, I will not be pursuing the matter.
Yeah,
why not be honest?
Isn't that irritating?
The reason for the delay, Seamus, was that she didn't want to take that number off her league table until she got something else to replace it. I mean, being realistic.
All I can say is I'm glad people like you are the intermediate between them and us, if you like, because you die, you lose the will to live trying to deal with it on your own.
Oh, you would. I mean, look, guys like me, we're just not wired right. We really aren't. We actually like this stuff.
Just going to chip in here. I'm helping a lady who has got terminal cancer, and she's got an Inland Revenue investigation going on, and it's been going on now for 3 years. And they're just not listening at all. She's not a client, you know what I mean? I'm not involved in the investigation. I've chipped in to help her out because she's being bullied.
Yeah, and if they sense weakness,
well, she's got terminal cancer, poor girl.
Yeah, they'll actually dial up the pressure. I've seen them do this before. I had a client 20 years ago who had 2 heart attacks during the course of an inquiry, and all the inspector did was say, right, well, in which case he may not survive, so you better bring forward the date and we'll do a settlement.
I think they're doing that to her because she's been at it a while now, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it might come as a shock to everybody else in the audience too, but I'm lovely to hear that somebody else has had the same experience that I've had and I've heard from others. Sheer bloody mindedness, to the point of almost inhuman insensitivity. But you've got to deal with it. I mean, it's just, I tend to disarm it with a bit of sarcasm and a bit of light humour, particularly if I'm in a meeting. But
so basically, what you're saying there is that they're starting from an assumption that you're avoiding tax.
They will always start from the assumption that you're wrong,
right,
and that they're right. I'm not saying they're going to play the avoidance card at you every time. but the language they use is quite, well, if you answer my questions or if you settle straight away, then I won't feel that I need to raise a penalty. Well, with all due respect, what grounds have you got for raising a penalty if you think I've made an innocent mistake? But of course, if they use the penalty word here, you go, oh, quick, send them a check.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when you get a parking ticket and you say, if you don't pay this in 7 days, it's going to double.
Yeah.
It's the same psychology. And they readily admit to using behavioral psychologists to draft these letters so that they're maximally persuasive.
I just find it absolutely amazing that supposedly civil servants take this approach.
Well, I'm the grandson of a civil servant. My grandfather was number 3 in the Treasury Rating Valuation Division. And I can tell you now, if Grandpa George was alive today, he would be absolutely spitting and fuming, because he always believed in the highest standards of probity and honesty in the civil service. And we just don't see it. I mean, interestingly, I know several people inside the Ministry of Defence. And I once complained that it was getting impossible to get plastic explosive. And they said, what do you want it for? And I said, I want to blow up HMRC. And he said, how much do you want? And when do you want it delivered? I mean, even the army hate HMRC. They are, I would argue, beyond the pale and out of step. They're certainly out of step with the feeling in the COVID. I mean, I think it was 2 weeks into the crisis, and they published a warning to NHS staff returning to the colours not to get involved in tax avoidance. So we were like, why would you do that? You threaten the very people who are coming in to save our nation. And then they did it again. And then they announced that they were going to go after anybody who claimed furlough relief because they believed most people were committing furlough fraud. Where's the basis for that accusation?
Targets as opposed to going for the big boys that are avoiding tax all the time.
Well, a bully will never pick on the biggest boy in the playground, will they? They'll always go and pick on the small boy. So, part of my role is to stand in front of you guys, stand tall and snarl at them.
You're obviously doing it very successfully, David. So that's
well, there was one meeting I attended, Chris, where I got a barrister, the client myself. Two revenue officers walked in, sat down, and the barrister looked at me and said, are you going to kick off then? I said, no, why? They haven't done anything to upset me yet. That set the tone for the meeting, let me tell you.
Very good. Good question, Seamus. I think Seamus wins the competition for the best background. So you do it, Seamus.
Yeah.
Thanks for your question. I'll just invite any other final questions. Have we got a final question from anyone?
See, I told you I'd bore them into submission by the end of this question, wasn't
No, I think you've done an amazing job, a truly amazing job, David.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I've got one quick question, just because I thought it was a good sort of angle. One of your slides, you talked about the 62 flats, and I think the stamp duty was at 60k, but you talked about if they'd have put a copy shop on the ground floor, it could have reduced to 20k, so they'd have saved £40,000. So I started thinking, well, how long would you have to have the coffee shop on the ground floor to, how quickly could maybe then you convert it to another flat? So, you've saved your 40k. How long would it need to be a coffee shop for?
I think arguably you would try to let it as a commercial space. It would be designated a commercial space on the planning. If after a period you could not let it, you could then apply for further conversion. And I do not think that would invalidate the original claim at all, because it's a later change of use. We recently looked at a development for somebody that is actually an assisted living scheme, where in fact, because it's assisted living, there are all kinds of offices for the carers, there are physiotherapy rooms, all the things that you would never normally see in a house. And because of the nature of the service charging structure, and there's a concierge-based service as well, we were saying, well, that's great. We've got, I think it was 184 apartments, but we've got this huge commercial activity on ground and one. So we can go for the minimum rate. in that particular case, those apartments were so expensive, we could only get it down to about 2.79, but arguably you can go. I mean, one of the interesting parts of that, and I forgot to mention it, and thank you for reminding me, is very occasionally student accommodation will actually be multiple dwellings capable. If you think of cluster apartments, that these large, and I realize that students aren't living in them at the moment, but cluster apartments, and sometimes you'll find people paying out on investments to buy student accommodation, paying 5% when doing a multiple dwellings claim might be better. That's what it goes back to what I was saying. You've got to look at it all different ways and pick the best route.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. So thank you very much for that, David. Yeah. So I always thought that SDLT might be a hard sell, but you've done a fantastic job, David. There are thanks, and with very little alcohol as well. So you again, you've done well.
Well, in fairness, I did tell you this was coffee. I told you it was coffee. No, genuinely, it was coffee. But Chris would have shot me if I come on with a Scotcher, man. But believe me, that's port of call number 2 as soon as this meeting ends. So, and the rest of you, go and have a nightcap. Enjoy your evening, please.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much. So, in terms of people wanting to contact you, I'll put something out on our WhatsApp group anyway, and we've got the recording, and Chris will take the follow-ups as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you want to add anything, Chris? You've been very quiet.
No, I've been. David is, the guru on stamp duty, one of the top 5 brains in the country on it. I just let him go. He does this a lot. It's what he does for a living.
Yeah,
but yeah, happy to deal with any questions that come through over the next few weeks, or any inquiries.
In fact, I've done so much of this, Chris, that although I'm only 53, my voice is 86. It's not true. I'm 60.
You're doing well. You're doing very well.
Chris, thanks for setting it up, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That's my pleasure, and I appreciate you guys coming on and talking to us. It's been fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just going to sort of close up really. Let me just present my screen. Hopefully this will work, which would be marvelous. So for next so for the next month, we've got hopefully you can see that. So next month, so this is the 4th of February. So our meeting is always on it's always the first Thursday of every month, starting at 7 o'clock. A friend of mine, Ian Walmsley, he's just started a podcast on planning. He's known as the planning geek, so he really understands planning to a very high level, and he's doing developments of his own. And he's kindly agreed to come on to our webinar next month and talk to us about the planning system and planning games. So I know he's got a couple of large projects going on at the moment, so that's sure to be really interesting. So just like to thank everyone for their attendance tonight. Much appreciated. Particularly like to thank Sam, as always, for his lending update, and particularly to Chris and David for coming on from Cornerstone and making stamp duty land tax seem so interesting, and it's great case studies there as well. For those who are on our WhatsApp group, then that's great. That's the best way to contact us. If anyone's not on the WhatsApp group, if you send me a message, we'll get you put on the WhatsApp group, and we've got our Facebook group and YouTube videos as well. So I'd like to hope that you all stay safe. I hope this year is much better than last. I'm sure it will be. I hope you and your families stay safe. And thanks again. Have a lovely evening, everybody. I'm going to close the call. Thank you very much.